It's been called a new form of sexual assault, online sextortion. What's driving this is
every night, as my mother painted on my makeup, I just held on to the promise that when I was done working tonight, I would get to go to Chuck E. Cheese. For 2 years, I slept on hotel and motel room floors, or in closets after a night of being groped and forced to have sex with strange men. Sometimes I was sold for as little as a $10 bag of crack. I was 10 years old, living as a nomad, with my mother and her boyfriend traveling from town to town along the Connecticut shoreline. I never did get to Chuck E. Cheese.
By my early 20s, I was dealing with psychological disorders so severe that I required regular hospitalizations and several medications to manage. So when Robert offered to help me, I welcomed his friendship. Robert introduced me to Bruce and William, saying they would give me money or that we were just going to hang out. But that was untrue. I had to let them do whatever they wanted to, which I let them, but mostly because they promised me that Robert would give me more cocaine. So because of my addiction, which was because of Robert, I was trapped. Robert King, for 20 years, sought out young men with varying degrees of psychological disabilities for the purpose of using them for prostitution. He would befriend the young men, offer them work, food, money, and other fake inducements, as well as provide them with illegal drugs to the point that they were financially indebted to him. At that point, he would arrange for them to trade sex for money to pay off the debt they owed him. He would drive these young men from Danbury directly to each client. The clients would be $200 to $250 per occasion. Some of Robert's clients included a Glastonbury businessman and a 72-year-old man from Westport. When he was arrested, Robert told police, "I didn't know I was causing any harm. My only crime was trying to help."
I was 18 when my life became a nightmare. I left my hometown to live with another family who I trusted, someone I knew. They said they would give me a place to stay and protect me. I had a rough home life and I was just looking for a positive change. Shortly after I moved to my aunt's house, she introduced me to Brian. Brian said he could get me a job in the restaurant industry. He seemed like a nice guy, so I went to meet with him. Instead of taking me to the restaurant, though, he took me to his East Hartford apartment. There I met Tony, Brian's girlfriend. Soon I realized Brian didn't have a job for me. They locked me up inside a bedroom, and they shot me up with heroin, despite me fighting with everything I had. I felt like there was no way out. At this point, I had no idea what was happening, but I later found out that my aunt had sold me to Brian. Then Brian sold me to other men. Random guys off the street to do whatever they wanted with me. And I would have to do whatever they wanted, whatever it was. If I didn't, I wouldn't get my heroin. My life was over, but I was one of the lucky ones. A detective in Hartford met me, and she helped me. I finally had someone to help, someone I could trust.
You just heard 3 first-hand accounts from actual victims of human trafficking in Connecticut. What you just heard is real. Real people with real families who are forced to engage in sexual activities against their will. Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm happy to see how many people are here because this is a serious affliction, not just nationally, but also here in the state of Connecticut. It is a very difficult topic to approach. Who actually wants to hear about human trafficking? It is an interesting subject, I'm sure, I'm sorry. But it is so painful and so personal that many people refuse to acknowledge that there is a problem. Thank you all for being here, because awareness of the human trafficking problem will initiate change, resulting in the development of dialogue and effective solutions. Tonight, we hope that you learn about the issue of human trafficking from a personal and professional perspective, to learn what is happening in Connecticut beyond the narrative that you hear in news stories. Our three panelists are extremely well versed in this subject. We have prepared a program that will give you a good overview of the subject, but we also hope to cover a lot during tonight's presentation. Please hold any questions you may have, as we will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the panel. If you wish to question anonymously, feel free to write the question on a piece of paper that was placed on your chair. These will be collected shortly before the Q&A session, and I will then ask some of these questions to maintain your confidentiality. The panelists will also be available at the conclusion of the program if you would like to speak to anyone on a more private basis. The Mercy High School Alumnae Association has organized this event as a service to our community. And if you take anything from this evening, I hope that you will at least know who you can turn to if you see something or experience something that should be reported. I will share this information with you here. This information is also printed on the back of each program. Please take these home with you and put the phone number somewhere where you can go to them if, God forbid, you should ever need them. Thank you again for coming. Now, to introduce our panel, Wendy Bowles is a special agent with the FBI in New Haven who works on violent crimes against children squad and is considered the FBI's subject matter expert for trafficking in Connecticut. Candace Sneed is Director of Gender Responsive Adolescent Services at DCF, leading the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team, also known as HART, for the department. Her role includes training of hundreds of law officers and caseworkers in identifying the risks and signs of human trafficking. Detective Jimmy Lacasse is from the Special Investigations Unit of the Middletown Police Department and will be sitting in for Captain Gary Wallace, who unfortunately had a family emergency. The Special Investigations Unit consists of a unit supervisor and trained detectives who specialize in handling all follow-ups regarding sex-related crimes, missing persons, domestic violence, children and youth abuse cases, DCF-related cases, and works with local schools. Senator Len Suzio is here this evening to discuss what is being done legislatively to bring Connecticut into alignment with federal standards. Carrie Fortier is our moderator this evening and is the president of the Mercy Alumnae Association. I will now turn the floor over to Carrie.
Okay, thank you, Marge. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. I want to take this first moment. I know you all probably already turned your phone off or silenced them, but if we could just take a moment, double check, make sure everything's on silent. Because this is a very serious subject and it's just better not to interrupt. Okay, all good. All right, so we have this esteemed panel. We have a ton of experience up here, so I really just want to kind of start it off and really understand what is human trafficking, what are the trends in Connecticut for now? What are we seeing? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What are you seeing professionally when it comes to human trafficking? So Tammy, if you'd like to start.
You can try this. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So unfortunately, what we're seeing in Connecticut is our numbers are increasing on an annual basis. To date, we have been collecting data on victims of trafficking in Connecticut, particularly kids under the age of 18. And since 2008, we're well over 750 unique referrals to the department. Every year, we're seeing that number increase. In 2016, we had 202 referrals. In 2015, we had 134 referrals. So the numbers are increasing. I expect when our final numbers are in for 2017 that we will exceed 202 referrals. We're almost done finalizing that data, and at this point, the number is over 202. The majority of our cases are female, but there are also male victims. Nationally, there are a lot more male victims identified, so my concern in Connecticut is we're not sure how to address our male population. As soon as we rolled out a training that we have on working with boys that are victims of trafficking, our numbers of male victims that were reported to our care line have increased. So I think in 2016, we had 17 referrals, so that was the highest number of male victims we've had thus far. Our referrals are from all over the state, so I want to kind of dispel that myth that it's only happening in certain parts of the United States or Connecticut, and that's not the case. You saw up on the quick clip that you saw, the internet is everywhere, computers are everywhere. We have had cases in areas that you would truly not expect, with kids you truly would not expect. And the way they're often recruited is via the internet, because that computer is often in their bedroom, could be in their living room, but as soon as you turn your head, there's somebody on that computer trying to recruit kids.
Great. Wendy, how are you seeing trends in Connecticut?
So I would agree a lot with what Tammy said. I don't know how much the actual crime is increasing or people's awareness of the crime is just increasing. We're even seeing Johns at times now are calling the hotline anonymously to sometimes report if they go out to visit a prostitute and she is young or she looks like she has been beaten or anything like that, to have those concerns. I can say that in interviews that we have done with pimps, so we not only find pimps and victims in Connecticut that are Connecticut, that live in Connecticut, we also, because Connecticut is situated between Boston and New York, there are a lot of pimps that cross state lines. So we have arrested some pimps from New York who live in New York. They've been caught here. We have had girls that we have found here from New York, from Massachusetts, from New Jersey. Pimps say that Connecticut is cheaper in terms of hotels, and is also viewed as having a lot of money and a lot of need. So they think that there are a lot of Johns in Connecticut who have a lot of money, so many of them will cross the state lines to bring the girls into the state here.
Can you just clarify what a John is?
So a John, sorry. So a John is the individual that is going to see the prostitute, that is buying the services from the girl or the boy. So, and sometimes there are females that will buy services from boys, I've heard, possibly also girls, but the term John is sort of what's used.
Jimmy, is there anything you're seeing on the more local Middletown area?
Yeah, so here in Middletown, of my own personal experiences, not so much. Again, it's new, or not that it's not existing in Connecticut, but it's not something that we're really seeing a lot of here in Middletown. But when we have suspicions or think that it could be, well, then we reach out to, to the FBI or something, someone who has more experience with that, to help us out and try to catch it before it's too late. But,
Would you say that maybe you're not seeing it as much because it's being deferred to DCF and FBI before it gets to you? Maybe it goes to other authorities?
That could be, I don't know if that's something that is available.
I don't think I've seen a recent case in Middletown. Doesn't mean that's not happening here, I just haven't seen a case.
So we did have a case a couple of months ago that was connected to Middletown. But I will tell you, in general, there are communities across the state that are not well versed in this. And something that Wendy alluded to earlier, as people start to get educated and understand what the red flags are, that's when we see the number of referrals start to increase. So we have done some areas in Connecticut that had 0 referrals. We had a very active team that was working in that area, and the cases skyrocketed. Again, not necessarily because it was increasing in that particular area, but people finally had that understanding of what to look for. So I think we, as a community in the Middletown area, Middlesex area, we have to do a better job of getting this information out, which is why you're here tonight.
I want to hold that mic because I have a follow-up to that. So you mentioned the red flags, and our awareness is what helps catch human traffickers and stop it in its tracks. So what are those red flags?
Sure, so there are some materials out on the table that we brought for you this evening, as well as the materials that were on your chair. There are 2 brochures from an organization called Love 146. Their home base is in New Haven, Connecticut, for the U.S. They're an agency that works across the globe at this point. There's really good information in there. There's also a great brochure for parents that was created by ASU, and then we also have hotline cards and bracelets for kids. So there are a number of red flags, and it doesn't mean because there's one, you identify a kid with one red flag that they're a victim of trafficking. It's really a compilation of multiple red flags and really that general awareness. So some of them, and I'm sure Wendy can help me with this as well, some of them include kids having things that you know they don't have the means to have. So we have had multiple kids coming home with things that we know they don't have money to pay for. When they have multiple cell phones, when they have an older boyfriend that seems to be kind of in that controlling position, or a very old boyfriend. If they're using some of the language in the life, and that language was mentioned earlier that I oversee Connecticut's Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. If you Google DCF HART, H-A-R-T, there is a list of the websites that are typically used to recruit and or exploit kids, and Love 146 keeps that up to date for us. And there's also a list of terminology that's used in the life. So if you start to hear some of that terminology, if there's injuries that you can explain, if the kid starts to withdraw. We had a case in Connecticut of a 14-year-old that had no risk factors. Nice area of the state, financial resources, straight A student, got along with her little brother, and all of a sudden her grades, her first year in high school, just plummeted. What do you think the parents were thinking? Drugs. So that was a good thing because the parents were paying attention and did some snooping in her room. And what they found in her room was a list of all the buyers she slept with, or Johns, is the term you heard earlier. And she also had some of those white hotel key cards. And what we learned, I mean, this is a kid that had no risk factors. We at DCF didn't know her, law enforcement didn't know her, or the family. But what we learned is she connected to a group of juniors and seniors. This is what they were doing. This they thought was a cool way of making money. And they told her if she wanted to be part of that group, she had to do it too. And if you remember back to that freshman year in high school, where you really, really want to fit in, she really wanted to fit in. And she did it. So there are just a number of risk factors, but if you start to see changes in your kids or things that, or they have that $1,000 cell phone that is out there right now, or 2 cell phones, those would start to be red flags. Do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to dispel a couple of myths when it comes to trafficking. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Taken, or Law & Order Special Victims Unit is another one I love. In those instances, it's almost really dramatized. In Law & Order, you know, they walk down into the basement and all these girls are like chained to the wall. That's not what it looks like. I can guarantee you that if you stay in hotels a couple of times a year, you probably have walked past a trafficking victim. They are moving around us like they're a regular person. A lot of these girls do not appear to be a victim. They sometimes they actually believe that they want to be there. There are many times that I walk into a hotel room to rescue a girl and she is angry at me. She is mad at me. She will yell at me. She calls me all kinds of names. She wants to be there. So many times these girls will walk around the hotels just like anybody else that is visiting a hotel. So it can be very, very hard to detect. It really looks like prostitution on its face.
So you kind of bring up a good point. What's the difference between prostitution and human trafficking?
So trafficking, for the federal government standards, anybody under the age of 18 does not have the ability to consent. So the federal law says that in that instance, a girl is being trafficked, whether she says she wants to be there or not. Prostitution is not a federal crime, so it's not something that the federal government investigates. Those are usually adult women who consciously make the decision and want to prostitute. Now, myself and others would probably tend to argue, does any prostitute really want to be a prostitute? I'm not so sure. But with adult cases, we have to prove an element of force, fraud, or coercion in order to make a case of trafficking for them. So that's sort of the distinction between prostitution. So we walk into a hotel room and we find an adult female in that room, and she says to me, nope, I want to be here, I want to do this, I know I have a pimp, I give him all my money, but that is what I want to do. Then unless I can somehow find another way of proving that she's being forced to be there, there's not a whole lot that I can do.
So when it comes to coercion, force, and fraud, what types of things are you seeing that the pimps are using to keep women and men as human trafficking victims?
So force would be, anything that you can think of. There's really two different types of pimps that we see. The gorilla pimp is the really mean pimp. He is the one that will beat you. He is the one that will, a lot of times they will tattoo girls. I have a victim who was beaten with cable wire. She was punched in the face several times. He tattooed a barcode on the back of her neck because she was his property. He put his nickname. She was 15 years old when she started working for him. She worked for him for about a year. There was a pimp in Massachusetts. This is a little gross. But there was a pimp in Massachusetts who, his way of distinguishing his girls from the other girls that were out on the streets was he would hold them down when he first got them, and he would take a vegetable peeler and he would peel their face right at their cheekbone the whole way down to the bone. And then the scar that was left on the girl's face was sort of his distinguishing mark. So everybody else out on the streets knew that those were his girls. Another thing that he would do would, whichever girl made the least amount of money, even if she made her quota, whoever made the least amount of money, he would defecate on the floor in the evening, and that was the only thing she was allowed to eat for the entire day, was that. So that sort of pitted the girls against each other, because then they needed to make more money than everybody else. They would try to make it so some girls made less. So that's sort of the force part. The coercion is where we see the other type of pimp that we call the lover boy pimp. This is what we see more of than the gorilla pimps, thank goodness. This is where the girl is absolutely in love with her pimp. Most of these girls get picked up into trafficking because they have something that they're missing. They have some void or voice, some void somewhere that they are trying to fill, and these pimps come into their lives and they fill that void. They pay them attention. They shower them with gifts at first. We're gonna have this great life together. We're gonna, build a business together. I just need you to sleep with these men and make us some money, and then we're gonna go. We're gonna do all these wonderful things together. And these girls buy it, and they hold on to it. And when we step into the picture, we have to try to break that bond that these girls have with their pimps. And you have to get, as a law enforcement officer, the girls to trust you and respect you just a little bit more than they do their pimps in order to get them to cooperate. And it really is very, very difficult. They also sometimes will drug their victims to make them do it. Sometimes the victims are already addicted to drugs, so they use that as a way to get them to sleep with people. The fraud would be
We've seen some pimps sort of convince girls to come with them, and they're going to get them into the modeling business. And then the modeling business very quickly turns into either pornography and or trafficking. It's sort of like a false promises of work that really isn't there. If they are immigrants, they sometimes will take their documents and they will hold on to their documents, and they will then force them to do that, or they won't be able to get their documents back. Those are some of the things that we see.
Very comprehensive. So that kind of answers a part of this question, but is there anything you can add when it comes to, you mentioned trying to shower them with love and promises, affection and future together. What other ways are used in order to entrap these young boys and girls?
People ask what the typical scenario is, and every time we think we have it all figured out, we see something totally different. And I think Wendy did a great job of talking about the fraud and the coercion piece. Many of these kids are looking for something that they're not getting at home, not getting at school, not getting in their community. And we've had production companies where kids thought they were going to go become singers, and if the kids see a business card, they think it's real. You know, you hand a kid a business card, say, I own a production company, and they buy in almost immediately, just because they're adolescents. The boyfriend scenario is probably the most predominant way that we see our kids lured in, and then also kept in. These kids become very dependent. We talk a lot when we do our full trainings about Stockholm Syndrome, really thinking about that bond that they have with that young person. And we've had kids where at points they've had opportunities to leave, and they truly do not leave. When we do our longer trainings, we talk a lot about the comparison with domestic violence. Very similar dynamics play out. And I think, though, we're in a different place with domestic violence than we were 20 years ago. I think this conversation in regards to trafficking of children is very new, and we're not fully bought into that yet. So when we see a kid that is going to her trafficker every Friday night and coming back home on Monday, it's really hard for us to comprehend why she's doing that. And we tend to start blaming the victim. So that dynamic is pretty strong in Connecticut, but also across the United States.
I just want to sort of explain too that it's actually, this happens very easily. Like this, I had one victim who she met a guy on Plenty of Fish. A lot of these dating sites are being used now for this lover boy type of him. She met a guy on Plenty of Fish. They wanted to smoke weed, so she thought he was coming up. He lived in Connecticut, she was in Massachusetts. She thought he was coming to pick her up to smoke weed. He comes and picks her up, he drives her back to Connecticut, and he dumps her in a hotel. And he makes her start prostituting. Another one, she saw her pimp in a hotel. He rode a taxi with her to, she was already prostituting, she was a runaway. He rode with her to Walgreens, they went back to the hotel, he took her money from her and said, get your stuff, you're coming with me. And she went with him. It happens very easily. It's really actually scary how easy it is sometimes for these guys to just pick these girls up.
Wendy was getting to another point that I wanted to call out, and I know the Senator will be talking to you in a little bit, but when we're looking at our kids that are involved in the life, there's not always an exchange for money. And Connecticut's laws are not as strong as our federal laws. Our federal laws are very clear that it's the exchange for anything of value. And when we're talking about our kids under the age of 18, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But those dynamics are helpful when we're looking at these cases, and certainly helpful for law enforcement. But when you're talking about kids under the age of 18, if they're having sex for a place to sleep, if they're having sex for a ride or for drugs because they're addicted, whether their trafficker got addicted or not, they're exchanging for something of value, and they're victims. And that dynamic gets a little difficult with Connecticut's laws, and I know the Senator will talk to you about in a little bit.
So we now know how traffickers entrap these young people. So what is it that the traffickers, the pimps are looking for in young people or even adults that is attractive to them or that they feel makes them an easy target? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think they're just looking for somebody to fund their lifestyle. A lot of times these pimps that we pick up, they're not, living in like these lavish homes. Sometimes they are driving nice vehicles, but many of them we find are actually moving from the drug industry, selling drugs, to selling people, prostitution. You can sell an ounce of crack once, you can sell a human being over and over and over again in the same night. Many of these girls, you charge, $200, $300 for an hour, and some of these girls, these guys will want these girls to have sex with 8, 10 guys a day. That's a lot of money for just one girl in one day. And then if he has a couple of girls that are working for him. So we really mostly find that these guys are they're living this lifestyle, they don't have to do anything, they go hang out with their buddies, they go to the casinos, they buy the fancy phones, while the girl is sitting in the hotel room and she is doing all the work and then having to hand over all of her money to him.
So in regards to our kids that we see pulled into the life, many of the kids are vulnerable. So in general, across the country, kids in child welfare, because kids in child welfare have had prior histories of abuse and neglect, are the most vulnerable. They want to fit in. They want things in life. They want that adult connection. They want that love. So lots of times they're targeting these kids. There's been traffickers that have looked at congregate care settings for kids. There are traffickers that scan internet sites and Facebook sites and social media sites for schools and look for groups of kids that are more vulnerable. So they're looking for kids that want something. There's some great documentaries out there that really dive into this, and we can certainly provide a list of some things for you to watch. One of the documentaries that you can look at this point through Netflix is Am Jake Doe. And that really brings you through the Backpage journey of going after Backpage for exploiting kids or for allowing individuals to post kids for sale. Now, there's pros and cons. We have lots of discussions with law enforcement. Backpage will cooperate and give information, but the reality is kids are being sold on Backpage. But not just Backpage. There's lots of social media sites out there that kids are being posted on. And the reality is our laws don't necessarily protect our victims. But whatever that trafficker can identify as a vulnerability, they will exploit. And you saw the girl up there where she was taking off her clothes because she thought there was this young boy that she kind of liked that wanted that video of her. And slowly but surely, he was able to get more from her, and then he started threatening her. That same kind of dynamic plays out with traffickers that are with our kids directly, that are exploiting our kids in hotels and in different buildings and so forth throughout the state.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, because I didn't until I saw I Am Jake Doe, Backpage.com is a website similar to Craigslist, and 80% of girls and human trafficking humans that are sold go through Backpage.com. What did you have anything to add?
So yes, law enforcement has sort of a love-hate relationship with Backpage. Of course, you never, ever want children to be exploited anywhere, but it happens. And right now, law enforcement, we sort of use the phrase that we know where all the rats are. The majority of sex trafficking and prostitution occurs and is posted on Backpage. And so we know where to go and we know where to sort of find all the rats. If Backpage goes away, do the rats go away? Not necessarily, but they're going to go somewhere where I don't then know where they are, and then they're harder for me to find. And Backpage is actually very law enforcement friendly in that if we send them any type of service like a grand jury subpoena, they get back to us very quickly and send us all the documents that they have. So there is a little bit of a love-hate relationship with law enforcement and Backpage.
Yeah, that's interesting because I know I Am Jake Doe, most of it is about legislation and lawsuits to get them to close down the ability to post girls and women, so it is an interesting dynamic.
Just to add to that, I think we have to look at it at its entirety. And I think what Am Jake Doe does a really nice job of doing is showing that unless we deal with this at the federal level, like Wendy said, there's always going to be a place. Right now, at least law enforcement can get information when they need it, but in the reality, we don't want kids sold anywhere. And until we deal with that at the federal level, it's going to continue to happen. If there's no back page, there's going to be another place.
So, I've heard also that a lot of the difficulty is that people who are in trouble and are being entrapped are afraid of authority figures. They're afraid that they'll get in trouble because they have been doing drugs because that's how they've been entrapped. So how has that impacted your ability to do your job as figures of authority? Is that something that really makes it difficult to help these people?
So human trafficking cases are very victim-centered cases for law enforcement, which is not the normal way that law enforcement moves. We are normally very prosecution-centered. We do what we need to do in order to get a case into court system and get a bad guy in jail. Trafficking cases just can't work that way. At the end of the day, the victim has to come first over the case. So the main goal, yes, victims at times are afraid of law enforcement. They're afraid of authority figures. We've tried to do a lot of trainings, Tammy, especially out with the local and the state police, just to sort of help them in how to deal with these girls, because a lot of times they're the first ones that come in contact with these girls, and how to deal with them and how to treat them to sort of help that. Normally, if I can get my hands on a girl, I can help to ease her and to get her to trust me, but it definitely is a process. And victims a lot of times are very vital to these cases. So, you know, we have girls who are 15 when they are trafficked. They might be 16 when we find them, and their trafficker might not get prosecuted until they are 18 or 19. Because I need to focus on that victim first. We need to get that victim whole. We need to get her services and get her to a place where she is healthier before we necessarily worry about the actual case.
So, poor Wendy, because if I could give every case to Wendy, I would. Both because Wendy knows how to engage the kids and she's there for them in the long term. I mean, she does not let these kids down, which is really important for these kids because that trafficker is trying really hard not to let them down and have that really strong relationship. This is no comment toward Middletown PD, because I will tell you it has not happened at Middletown PD. But, and I want to get home safely. That being said, we've had some challenges with local law enforcement, and part of it is, again, Connecticut's laws. They are not victim-centered. They do not align with the TVPA. So if I can get the feds to take a case, I am much more confident that that child has no risk of being criminalized or arrested for anything that she's participated in. So I will turn to the feds if I absolutely possibly can. On the counter end, we have had cases with local law enforcement where local law enforcement is looking for ways to arrest kids. And they can't arrest for prostitution because he or she's under the age of 18, but they certainly can find other things that kid has engaged in and arrest them. And sometimes that dynamic becomes very threatening. And I've seen it in Connecticut and I've seen it across the country where law enforcement will use that kind of tactic to get kids to disclose information. And that is not effective with this particular population. And that's what Wendy really does well with. She doesn't use that tactic. She's engaged with the kids and she's in it for the long haul with them.
So Wendy, I want to follow up on something because you said once you engage with these people, sometimes you feel as though you can ease their pain a little bit. Do you feel that some of that is because you're a woman and you're younger and so they can relate to you more? Is that a dynamic that helps? And are there other, obviously Tammy is a woman, so are there a lot of women who are in these efforts in the FBI and DCF for tackling these issues?
I actually don't know that it's necessarily because I'm a woman. I actually, for several years, worked with a male counterpart who was phenomenal at this as well. I think it's just caring. You have to make the child aware that you care. And, you know, please understand, this is, it's very, very time consuming. When I first come across a victim of trafficking, I will call her and or see her every single day for months, every single day, because I need her to recognize, because you'll make these promises to these kids when you're talking to them. Like, listen, I'm gonna be there, you know, we're gonna help, we're gonna stand by you through this. And she's like, oh, okay, big shot. I've heard that before my entire life and nobody ever sticks around. That's their sort of take on things. I had a case with two victims, 16 and 17, and I first came across them, I believe, on a Friday, and I told them on Monday that we had taken their phones as evidence. So I said, I'm going to come back on Monday and I'm going to bring you guys cell phones. So I went back on Monday and I took them cell phones that they could use, and the 17-year-old said to me, you are the first person that has ever followed through with what they said that they were going to do for me. So as you know, somebody that's trying to bond with these kids, if you tell them that you were going to do something, you darn well better do it. Or you better reach out to them and let them know why you're not doing it. Because they almost like they're traffickers, which is a little sad, they will cling on to you. You will become, in a very short amount of time, you will become the person that they feel like they can trust the most in their lives. And you know, it's sad because they've known me for like a month. I shouldn't be the person in their lives at, you know, the age of 16 that they can trust the most. So you really just have to show them that they care. And every time that we go out and see these kids, by most of the times that we go out and see these kids, we don't talk about the investigation. I take them out for coffee. I take them out for lunch. Hey, let's go get you some clothes if you need some clothes. I've had girls call me in the middle of the night. They're older, they're 18, they're on the streets, they have no food. I've driven in the middle of the night and given one of my victims a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter so she could have something to eat. You just have to care about them as people at the end of the day.
Great, so you kind of started to talk about the actual process of helping these people. So how do you first make contact? You said you go and you try and make contact every day, but how do you first make that contact and actually get them to talk to you?
So it depends on how we learn about cases. There's a couple of different ways that we'll learn about cases. Sometimes if like a local police department and or the state police come across a victim, they'll reach out to us and be like, hey, this is what we got, can you help? So we'll go out and we'll help. Sometimes that's how we know about the victim. We really developed a great circle in Connecticut between service providers. If Tammy comes across a victim, even if she's not sure if it's a victim, she'll reach out to me. I get emails from Tammy all the time. I love Tammy. And she'll be like, hey, this is what I got. What do you think? And then we'll go out and we'll interview the child. And from that moment on, you sort of like start the process. I get, if anybody calls the Polaris Project, the hotline, and it's an individual in Connecticut, I get an email from the Polaris Project saying, hey, this person called in, this is what they said, and then you attempt to go out and try to investigate it from there. So it really just sort of depends on how it is that we find out about cases. We also, as the FBI, will do our own sting operations, where we will comb through Backpage, we'll try to find ads for girls that appear to be young, and we will contact them, and we will set up dates. And we will pretend to be the John. And then once the girl shows up, we identify her. She is not allowed to leave until she is able in one way or another to verify for us how old she is. So we make sure that she's not under the age. And then if she is under the age of 18, then we'll call DCF and we'll get the whole process started from there.
To reiterate the process, so in Connecticut, DCF, Department of Children and Families, will accept and respond to every case of trafficking, even if the alleged perpetrator is not the parent, guardian, or entrusted caregiver, even if we don't know who the alleged perpetrator is. So that's a little bit different than most states in the country. Most states, child welfare says if it's not the identified perp, they're not going to take the case. So does not mean though that we as DCF are going to take custody of a kid or put the kid in a residential treatment center. It just means that's the central intake for these cases. And any case identified as possible trafficking, I review and I send to the task force, which Wendy's on the task force. So we have folks from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the State's Attorney's Office, State Police, and FBI on the task force. And they review every referral. And sometimes there's not enough information on there, like Wendy said, but we'll pass it along because it may be connected to another case. They may recognize the name in the referral, or one of the kind of the identified red flags in the referral may ring a bell for them. So we'll send it along, but it's a nice loop where we're able to ensure every case is followed up on in Connecticut, which is very, very unique.
Okay, so, wrong mic. So now we know how to identify it, we know how it happens. What can we do as citizens if we suspect a friend or a loved one or even a stranger, someone we just met, is in trouble?
Sure, so I'm going to add one more thing to the last question because it'll tie into next steps. Love 146 I mentioned earlier, they're an organization that has their home office in Connecticut. They do some amazing work with our young people. They have a service called Survivor Care, and that service has two components. It has something called a rapid response, which is a one-time intervention for kids that are either high risk or identified as a victim. It's very focused on safety planning. They get a backpack called a Survivor Backpack with tons of stuff. It has a blanket, it has a pillow, it has a teddy bear, it has hygiene products, it has the list of the national hotline numbers, it has a bracelet that has the hotline number inside it that one of our survivors actually created. She was 14, and she created the bracelets for other kids. So it's very focused on when you're ready to get help, this is what you do. This is who you call. It even has a cell phone that only calls 911 because if a kid has a phone from the trafficker, we want them not to be using that when they're ready to get some help. We collaborate with law enforcement. So before a rapid response is done, we ensure that it's okay with law enforcement because we don't want to hurt the case in any way. So there's a very deliberate partnership. The other end of survivor care is long-term survivor care, and that's where a very specially trained worker works with that young person until he or she no longer wants to work with them. So they will answer the phone at 1 o'clock in the morning. They will go to PPTs at schools. They'll provide supports to families. They do everything and anything that young person, that young survivor needs. So we have those two terrific resources in Connecticut for identified high risk or victims of trafficking. On the opposite end, prevention and educating our kids, they have a curriculum called Not a Number. It is a 5-session curriculum that's very focused on educating kids. Talks about healthy relationships, internet safety, so forth and so on. That has been offered to every school in Connecticut. We also have a 1 hour, it's actually 45 minutes depending on the framework of the audience, presentation for kids, designed for kids, to educate them. Because kids often see these red flags and don't know what to do. So until we arm our kids with this information, the traffickers, the buyers are going to have a head start at our kids. There is also some very good internet trainings out there. There's a person, he's a police officer, I think he's retired at this point, does an amazing job with training for kids and families, and we've hosted a few of those events across the state. And I'm telling you, the parents love the training because they learn so much about the internet and how these kids are accessing sites that we don't even know they're accessing, and or how traffickers are accessing or monitoring our kids, and our kids are not even aware of it. So I think first and foremost, we have to start to educate our kids. I sent a letter to every superintendent 2 years ago and said, we can provide training to your faculty. We can provide training to parents, because I constantly hear parents aren't going to want their kids to be educated on this. It's not happening, and they don't want to talk about it. So we've said we will provide education to your parents. And then after those 2 stages, we are happy to provide education to kids. And if parents want to opt out, that is fine. Very few schools took us up on that. And that's really, really unfortunate. Last comment, and then I'll pass it over. There is a new documentary that was created by survivors called I Am Little Red. It's about a 10-minute clip. It's based on Little Red Riding Hood. Really, really well done. It is available to schools, and it is definitely appropriate for younger kids, very early middle school. Phenomenal job. It's pricey. I'm hoping long-term we can negotiate a way to get that into every single school. But in the meantime, that awareness presentation I told you about, that one-time presentation, is available to any school that's open to having it.
Before you pass that, you mentioned not a lot of schools have taken advantage of that not a number program. So what can people here who are parents of children, not necessarily Mercy, but obviously people from the greater community, what can they do to speak with their superintendents or try and bring it up again?
So interestingly enough, the schools that we have started to get into, we are starting to get into some schools right now. I just today got an invite from Windsor going into their very early school, but they want to engage all levels of their educational community. Talk to your superintendents. If they are interested, we will make it happen. I mentioned the Heart website. I know it's not like an advertisement thing, but if you Google DCF Heart, you will have my contact information. I also have a coordinator that works with me. She's wonderful. She's like my right and left-hand person. Her name's Yvette Young. So you can reach out to either of us. We will make sure you're connected to the right resources to have that training. And they're free. There's no charge for any of these trainings, so that's really important. We've even done some trainings for parents, for communities similar to this one in the evening, so we can meet the parents when they're out of work and when they're available. So there's really no excuses for communities not to be educated, and we can phase it so parents are comfortable. When I have trained teachers, it's interesting, when they walk in the door to the training, they'll say, well, I wasn't sure if I was going to come to this training. I don't really know how relevant it is, but, thank you for putting this on, and they'll sit in the audience. And then the response was very powerful during the training, and afterwards they tell me this should be mandatory. So it's really just getting in the door, and sometimes parents are the best way in. Most of the time, parents are the best way in.
Do you have anything to add? Yeah.
I would also just say, if you see something, it's like standard, say, but if you see something, say something. Don't be afraid if something doesn't look right to reach out to someone and say something about it. The best thing about our group that we have is that we all talk. So like I said, if you call the Polaris Project hotline, they're going to call me. If you call the DCF hotline, they're going to call me. If you call me, I'm not going to call the hotline, but I'll call Tammy. So you just need to reach out and say something. I was staying in a hotel once with some friends, and the room next to my friend's room, constant in and out all night long. And the next morning my friend was like, man, people next to me, they must have been having like some kind of a party or something, because there was constant people in and out of that room. I'm like, that was not a party. That was not, that was probably a prostitute in that room. You see something like that, don't be afraid to reach out and say something. It's not any of your jobs to determine if human trafficking is going on. It's our job to determine if human trafficking is going on. And for the kids that I see in the room, if you have any concerns about any of your friends that with any of these red flags, please do not be afraid to say something to somebody, because if we can save a child, that's a great day for me. Oh, one other thing. One of the reasons I like to come to these is I like to sort of put a friendly face to the FBI. We've been in the news a little bit lately, if anybody has noticed. So I like to sort of put myself out there to let everybody know that I'm approachable, I am friendly. Any of you are welcome to contact me anytime you want. I have people from all over the state that will call me and be like, hey Wendy, I heard you talk like a year ago. Admittedly, I probably don't remember who they are. But they're like, hey, I saw X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And we'll talk it out for 10, 15 minutes. And if there's something more, then I'll be like, all right, let's see what I can do next steps. But do not ever be afraid to at the very least reach out to me. I think the FBI's main numbers on the internet. Just call and ask for me. I'm there. I'm friendly.
All right, so what happens to these victims? We've kind of heard the story of how you go in and talk to them, how you identify them, but in the end, what happens to them? How do they go through the system, and what happens at the end?
So we'll start on the low note and we'll end on the positive note. So on the low note, getting out of life is a process. So similar to that domestic violence scenario I gave you earlier, these kids will often go back to their traffickers. They have a bond with their traffickers. They're often getting something from them, usually that it's very emotional, that they're attached to their trafficker. So often we see that, and I think the national average is these kids go back to life about 7 times. So it's hard work. It's hard for law enforcement when they rescue or recover a kid and a month later they're back on the streets. It's hard for DCF workers who's feeling like, wow, we made some progress, and then she's back with this person. But I will tell you, on the opposite end, when they have the supports and resources, particularly when they have adults in their lives that care about them, that are consistent, similar to what Wendy told you. I had the same dynamic with a state trooper. He is amazing, and it's male, and he is so consistent with these kids, and maybe even be one of the persons she mentioned. But just that consistency, we see them come out at the end doing really, really well. Survivor care, we have had some great outcomes when they have that adult that's on that journey with them, that's not judgmental when she does go back to the life. And we've seen kids graduate high school, we've seen kids start college, we've seen kids get full-time jobs. So we're seeing that progress, but it's a journey. And it really requires everyone involved. It requires schools that don't give up on the kids. It requires activities and sports and clubs that, because the kid misses a period of time, that welcomes them back in at the end of the day. It's when we have people in the community that are offering something to eat or a warm place to stay when they need it. So all those dynamics are really important, and we do see the positive outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I definitely won't sugarcoat it. It's hard to say the least. And Tammy's right. It's not sort of if these girls will run, it's when these girls will run. And you have to hope you have a bond with them good enough that when they do run, they'll reach out and they will call you. The population of the girls that I find the hardest is the girls who, through the course of the investigation, will turn 18. And many times these girls, whatever state it is that they live in, they are fed up with DCF. I love DCF, but many of them are fed up with DCF, and so they will sign themselves out. And 9 times out of 10, those girls are back on the street and they are prostituting. I have an 18-year-old victim right now who's in New York, and she's been arrested twice for prostitution because the services are not there for that age range of girls, because they don't have, when they're in DCF care, they have the housing. They have all that, and they don't have that when they're 18 and they think that they can do this on their own. I have a victim in Massachusetts who she's trying to decide if she turns 18 if she's going to stay in DCF's care or not, and her option, if she doesn't, is to become a stripper. And I told her that's not an option, and we're going to come up with a better option. So it really is very difficult because they come out of it with a stigma against them. Coming back to schools, everyone in the school thinks they're a prostitute. And it's a really, really tough for them to sort of come back out of that life. Though there really are some great success stories. But it's a lot of people assume that, the pimp goes to jail, he's been sentenced, okay, case done. And no, it's like years and years and years to try to keep these girls on stable ground.
The key here is prevention. We don't want the kids in the life. And I will tell you, we see quicker success stories the earlier we intervene. So that one young person I told you about, the 14-year-old, where everything seemed to be right in her life and ended up pulled into life because she was very vulnerable, just as being a teenager, wanted to fit in her freshman year of high school. Her parents were extremely engaged from day one. They're the ones that called the department. She's doing really, really well. So the sooner we get to these kids, the better, which is again why we have to educate our kids, who often are the first ones to see some of these red flags, but also our communities, and then ultimately prevention. If you Google the Trafficking in Persons Council, it is a legislatively mandated body in Connecticut. They have a very targeted effort right now to address the demand. So we're talking a lot about the traffickers tonight, but we're not talking about the buyers. And until we make it not okay to buy sex from a kid, this is going to continue. So you will see probably some media that's going to increase over the next few months on the demand campaign. But if you're interested in some of the work, just Google Trafficking in Persons Council. You'll see some information.
You beat me to it, Tammy, because my next and last question was, I've read that one way to combat human trafficking is to end the demand for it. So how do you envision we do that? If you could expand a little bit on that concept.
So I think there's a number of things we need to do. I think in general, we have to come down harder on the demand side. And of late, I have seen some of the buyers plastered all over the media. There was a operation, I think it was in Guilford one day, where they had the buyers plastered all over the media. That, I think, is helpful. We need to start calling it what it is. If you go back in time, probably 4 years ago, the faces that I saw on the media were the prostitutes, and their names were all over the media. So we really have to start turning this around. Some of the national data suggests 1 out of every 10 men buy sex at some point in their life. So again, it's a societal norm, and until we start talking about that, we're not going to get down to the issue. And then we also see some of the age defense. I didn't know she was that old. Connecticut has a law that really fights against that. You can't say that. Now, Wendy can give you some of the dynamics around that, but to me, that's a really sorry excuse. So we have to make it not okay as a society before we're going to really get down to the demand side.
I would just say that from the federal side, so again, prostitution is not a federal crime. So I can't most times arrest a buyer. The federal statute just did change recently to include buyers. But the federal government has very stiff penalties for individuals that are traffickers. The federal law, a girl doesn't have to go through with a sex act. A man can, there's all these things that they can do. They can advertise, they can transport. So if a gentleman drives a girl from location A to a hotel for the purposes of her prostituting, though she never actually has sex with a single person, he can be arrested for trafficking under the federal law. If it is a girl and there's been no force, fraud, or coercion under the federal law, a trafficker will get a mandatory minimum of 10 years in jail. If there's force, fraud, or coercion, or the girl is under a certain age, I think it's like 14, then it's a mandatory minimum of 15 years in jail, which means that the judge cannot give that offender anything less than 10 or 15 years in jail. Just recently, it was included, Johns have now been included, so someone that buys a girl for sex can be charged with human trafficking. The one sort of caveat to that is that, again, it comes with a very, very stiff penalty. So you have a lot of times on the local or state side where a buyer of sex will get like a slap on the wrist, and then if they get charged federally, they're going to get a 10-year mandatory minimum, which is a sting. So the federal government a lot of times will not charge an individual with trafficking if they are a buyer unless we are actually able to prove that either A, they were aware that the individual they're having sex with is underage. And actually the FBI in Texas did prosecute a buyer because they were able to prove that he was aware that the girl he was sleeping with was underage, so he got 10 years. Or if we can prove that they were aware that the girl is being trafficked. And a lot of times, I honestly don't know that these guys are. A lot of these girls can appear to be, it's a tough line sometimes, 16, 17, 18. It's hard to tell the difference for me, even. So that can be a little tough. So we don't tend to prosecute a lot of Johns on the federal side. It's actually just a little sort of a funny story. I went to a hotel once. I mean, these guys, like a lot of them, they just don't care. Like, they're not even afraid of law enforcement. I went to a hotel once, and we got like a tip, I think from the hotline, that a girl, I think it was a woman, that she had been beaten. So we went out there and we found her and we're talking to her, and a guy shows up who is John, and he's there to have sex with the girl that we were talking to. And he sits in his car. Now, we all know who he is. And I mean, we're an obvious heavy police presence there. There's, cruisers, all that kind of stuff. And he sits in his car outside the hotel for an hour waiting for us to leave. So he can then go in the room and have sex with this girl. Until I walk up and knock on his window, and I'm like, seriously, dude? Get the frick out of here. Like, what are you doing? I'm going to arrest you just for being stupid, I think, if I can. Like, go away. They're not afraid. It's really sort of sad. It's sort of a funny story, but they're not afraid.
Okay, so any last words before I invite Senator Suzio to talk about legislation? Okay, great. Thank you, panelists. So I'll pass the floor over to Senator Suzio, and he'll give us an update on legislation here in Connecticut.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry, this is too good an opportunity for me to pass up. When Agent Bowersox referred a few minutes ago to the prominence of the FBI in the news lately, I have to ask her, is there anything you can reveal to us about the Russians or the secret news?
I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
She means it. Well, I am State Senator Len Suzio. I represent Senate District 13, which is part of Middletown, Middlefield, Meriden, and Cheshire. And I am on 6 different committees in the legislature, one of which is the Children's Committee. And I'm co-chair of that committee as well. And a few weeks ago, in line with that, I met Tammy Sneed for the first time, who shared with me information about this crime, which I was only dimly aware of. I think, like most people who came here tonight, I wasn't aware of how it's been going and how the volume of these cases is picking up substantially. And so it got my attention right away. And one of the depressing things about being a legislator is that you do hear a lot of sad stories and things that you can't do much about. But one of the good things about being a legislator is that you do hear some stories and some bad things that you can do something about. And I am, as co-chair of the Children's Committee, and I'm in a pretty powerful position to introduce legislation in Connecticut regarding anything that pertains to children. And so the sexual trafficking of minors, of adolescents, is something that I can hopefully play a critical role in. Now, I want to just say to you that getting a bill through the legislature is no easy process, even for a chair of the committee. And I did bring some information with me tonight. Unfortunately, I didn't expect the crowd this size, so I didn't bring enough. But if any of you want to contact me at the legislature, we can email to you a document that kind of explains the process. But the good thing is that we can start the ball rolling, and it's going to involve, there's another lesson I learned at the Capitol. You can't get anything done on your own. And a very, very critical component of any attempt to get legislation passed is to get the public involved. You can play a critical role. You may not be a legislator, but you can influence legislation. And last year, in fact, I had a woman over in Cheshire who came to me, and she wanted a certain piece of legislation she was interested in passed, had to do with libel laws and lawsuits overseas. And so we introduced the legislation, and lo and behold, we got it through the Judiciary Committee. I'm on the Judiciary Committee as well. And then we got it through the Senate, and then to our great surprise, we also got it through the House. It's rare that you can get a bill through the very first time. So I told Jane, I said, darn, you got to run for the legislature next year because you got a bill through the first time, and that's a rare occasion. But believe it or not, you can play a very, very critical role in legislation that's important to you. And if you decide that this is important to you, I want to tell you how you can play a role in it. First of all, There's a lot to be done, but my approach is you start out simple. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce legislation or raise a bill in my committee, the Children's Committee, that will basically make Connecticut's law parallel the federal law. I think that's, you got to start out with some reasonable goals too. You can't go for the whole moon at once. So I think the first step that we want to do is we want to make Connecticut's law parallel the federal law. So we will be raising a bill, that's the term they use, raising a bill in the committee. And when a committee raises a bill, every bill is supposed to have a public hearing. So we will definitely be having a public hearing. The wording of the bill hasn't been worked out yet. That will be done in the next couple of weeks. But we will then post a notice of public hearings on the bills that the committee is raising. Our committee deadline to get a bill out of our committee and onward through the legislative process is March 15th. This is what they call a short year in the legislature. So it's starting tomorrow, snowstorm or no snowstorm, we're going to convene. And it has to adjourn by May 9th by our state constitution, which determines when we can adjourn, and when we convene and when we adjourn. And the regular session starts tomorrow and ends on May 9th. So the Children's Committee has a deadline, what they call a JF deadline, joint favorable report. If after the public hearing is over, the chairs decide they want to have a vote on a particular bill, we will convene a committee meeting and we'll have a vote on the bill. And if the majority of the committee votes for the bill, it will then proceed out of that committee. And in this case, this bill, I am certain, will go on to another committee, the Judiciary Committee, because they'll have to review any changes of laws of this sort. And they themselves they won't have public hearings at that point in time. The public hearing will be held in my committee, the Children's Committee, but they will then, at one point or another, debate, discuss, and then decide whether they're going to vote on this or not. By the way, just getting a vote sometimes can be difficult to do. I've gotten a certain reputation in Connecticut. I've been pushing very hard against the law that exists called the early release law, where they're letting these violent criminals out of jail early, who have a high degree of recidivism, and we're needlessly exposing the communities to rapists and all sorts of violent predators. And I got that all the way through last year. We got it through the Judiciary, then we got it through the Senate, and they didn't take it up for a vote in the House. So it was like I got to third base, it got stranded at third base. Well, when we introduced this piece of legislation, I like to go all the way around. First, second, third, and then score, go all the way home. But it's going to be impossible to do without public involvement. So we will definitely, number one, keep you informed. If you want to contact me directly, you can go on to the Connecticut Legislature website and look me up. It's len.suzio@cga.ct.gov, right? Easy. Now, I'll tell you, my personal private email address is lensuzio, no dots, at Gmail. So contact me at Gmail, and then I'll forward it to my own official email address at the Senate. But what we will do is anyone who's on that list, and I'll also contact the folks here at Mercy, I will let them know the content of the proposed bill and when the public hearing will be held. And then the committee will have the public hearing. You can show up. Anybody is welcome to show up. And you'll be allowed 3 minutes to give oral testimony, and then you can submit a book of data if you want. There's no limit on the written testimony, but for practical point of view, you have to keep the oral testimony to 3 minutes. Now, I will say this, and I don't want to intimidate you or scare you, but once you give your oral testimony, the committee may want to ask you questions. And usually it's not aggressive or in your face stuff, especially something like this. It's not, I don't think, going to be a contentious issue. But you can be prepared to answer questions, and the committee will ask you good faith questions, especially if your testimony is particularly effective. It probably will provoke some questions, and that's a good sign. It's not the sign that the committee's like, oh, we're out to get you, or trip you up over some kind of technical point. So I would encourage you to use this. How many of you ever gone to the legislature and testified before? Well, we got a few people here, but very few. Some maybe fewer than 10. But well, we must have close to 100 people here, I would guess. So, hey, you know what? Get involved. Bad things happen when good people do nothing. And you have an opportunity to do something good here. I'm willing to kind of carry the ball as far as I can, but it's like poor Tom Brady the other day, and you know, he needed a 12th player out there to protect him. And, I'm no Tom Brady, believe me, I'm not Tom Brady, but it is a team sport. Politics is a team sport. Really, it's no one does it by themselves. It's the nature of politics that you have to develop a consensus. You have to work together, and we have to listen to you, the public. You know, there's so much more I could say, but I know I've got a very limited amount of time. So let me just say this: that you can't believe how effective your voice is at the Capitol, because so few people contact us. But everyone who does, my rule of thumb is if somebody contacts me about an issue, he or she's representing 100 voters that haven't. They're either too apathetic or they're too intimidated or what, but they just don't go any farther than just, you know, vent at the television set when they watch some story or when they read the newspaper. So, believe it or not, because there are so many people who don't get proactively involved, when you do get involved, your voice is magnified many, many times. And that's the way it's supposed to work ideally. All too often it doesn't. We don't meet the ideal. This is a great opportunity. If every one of you in here, or many of you get involved, we have a great chance of getting legislation that we can move forward to address this horrible, abusive practice. I don't know, when I hear stories about this stuff, I can feel the hair on the back of my neck just going up, you know. It's so disgusting and revolting to me how we can use children like they're animals and treat them as if they're just things and not real human beings, not our brothers and sisters. So do something good. Even if you don't feel like it, do something good. Come to speak, and if you can't do that, at the very least, contact us in writing. Say, I support, when we come up with the Senate bill or the bill number, we'll tell you what it is. I support such and such and such. And then the final step will be, if we can get, you know, we're going to have to lobby some of the committee members, so there's like a dozen or so people on the committee, so we'll let you know who they are, and then you can start inundating them with some phone calls and emails. It can be fun tormenting your legislature, you know, and then beyond that, it just spreads, right? I mean, it's like, so you tell a neighbor or a friend, you get your spouse, your best friend or whatever to do something, and man, it can explode and you can get great things done. So, being a politician, I like to speak for another 2 hours, but I know that won't work out too well. So I will open it up to any questions you might have or any thoughts you might have, or however you want to go.